are just to begin the third session of our conference. First of all, I would like to welcome Ambassador of Poland, Mr. Paweł who joined us. Thank you for your presence. The title of this session number 3 is United Remembrance in United Europe, ? First of all, maybe I will introduce our speakers. Then I will deliver a short speech because I was asked to both moderate and deliver short speech, short presentation of our criticism towards the House of European History as the platform. And then I will give the floor to our panelists, and I will ask them to be brief and keep time strictly, because we are a little bit late. Dr. Łukasz Kamiński, who is president of the institution of the platform of European Memory and Conscience, former president of the Institute of National Remembrance, Polish historian specializing in the history of Poland after the year 1945. Professor Hannes Gissurarson, Academic Director of Icelandic Research Center for Innovation and Economic Growth, doing research on Icelandic communists, and he translated the Black Book of Communism to the Icelandic language. Mr. Zsolt Szilagyi, Romanian politician, member of the Hungarian People's Party of Transylvania, member of the executive board of the platform, and close collaborator of Laszlo Tőkés, member of our board of trustees. And Toomas Hiio, Estonian historian, member of the executive board of the platform, research director of the Estonian Institute of Historical Memory. And me, Pawel Ukielski, I'm deputy director of the Warsaw Rising Museum. I was member of the executive board of the platform for 3 terms so far. And now, a few words about the House of European History. I think many of you already read our report on the exhibition of the House of European History, which is very critical, I have to admit. It was prepared basing on study visit. Last year in August, 19 members of the platform or collaborators of the platform visited the House of European History. They delivered their remarks, and then the full report basing on those remarks was prepared. Why the House of European History is so important, why it is so important to debate whether the exhibition there is proper or not, whether it tells the history of our old continent in a balanced way, in the best possible way. First of all, it's the first such an institution that was established on European level. It means it is the first attempt to present European common historical narrative line, and thus to present the idea of European identity. Secondly, such institutions, such museums are, which might be for some people hard to imagine, but they are very, very powerful tools in shaping common remembrance. They are very synthetic. They are talking about history, presenting the history in a language that is well understandable for ordinary people. They are very often visited by hundreds of thousands visitors a year, so they influence them very much. It is also because it is also very important to understand what they really present, not to focus on detail, but to focus on the overall message. This is the most important, to understand what is the overall message delivered by the narrative exhibition. Of course, there is always debate whether some facts are omitted or not, whether they should be present more or less in the museum's exhibition, but it is not only the facts that matter. It is also the question of proportions, the question of the main narrative line, the question of language used, the question of scenography, light, sound. Everything influences, because museum exhibitions are not only understood, they are very often felt in an emotional way by the visitors. Therefore, in my short speech, I will focus on the overall message. I will not focus, you can read our criticism on various levels, also according to facts presented or omitted, etc., in the report. But what is the overall message of the House of European History? In our opinion, it's an exhibition that suggests that we should be ashamed for being Europeans. No reason for pride there. It does not present our common European values, as it would be expected in such a place. I would define it as history of overcoming. It's not an accident that the main narrative line starts with the French Revolution. Then we face history of overcoming of different limitations of Europe, of society, and therefore we believe that it is rather Hegelian or neo-Marxist narrative line. Story of an inevitable progress, as in Marxist ideology. It shows the process of overcoming limitations by Europeans, and it is presented in our belief in a very biased ideologically way. What are the European values that should be presented there? Democracy, freedom, human dignity. It is almost absent there. It is not exposed properly. And what is very important, for example, for Central Europeans, it is an example of what I'm saying, the story of the Cold War. It is not the story of world of freedom, world of democracy, fighting against the world of totalitarian rule. It is the story of two equal systems that are competing. Both of them are developing through the time, and it is hard to understand why they are fighting each other. No question of freedom, no question of economic freedom also, no question of human dignity is shown as a base of this conflict. And it is cumulated in the very end of this story. We reach the year 1989, And what happens? Well, one system collapses. It's not properly explained why, and there is no reason to be proud of it. Although it could be really great moment of pride of European values, the desire for freedom, the desire for democracy. It was not the accident that Central European countries wanted to join the West. Of course, it was the question of material status also, but it was mostly the question of values. So this global remark is a basic and fundamental cause of all other limitations, in my opinion, all other limitations of the House of European History. All the omissions on the exhibition, all the ideologically biased comments and descriptions. For example, there is almost no religion there, no spirituality. Problems with proportions, some topics are almost missing, some are very broadly presented. Also lack of strict data. There are very seldom numbers used in the exhibition, and many other. The House of European History was established and prepared without broader debate, which I would recognize as a cornerstone of all further mistakes. And our report is the most complex analysis which explains why we can call the House of European History a missed opportunity. Thank you very much for your attention. And let me pass the floor to Mr. Łukasz Kamiński.
Please pass the microphone to.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I titled my very short presentation, What Remembrance Does Europe Need? And one may ask, why shouldn't I first discuss the problem whether Europe really needs remembrance? I think it is not necessary to speak about it today in front of an audience of specialists in the field. We don't need to convince each other that every community requires at least some elements of common identity. The European community is not different. One of the strongest identity-building factors is remembrance. Also, we all know that this kind of community needs common values, which should be rooted in the past. So the real question is not whether we need European remembrance, but what kind of common memory do we need? The kind of remembrance we choose can determine the future we will have. In the next few minutes, I will propose a few indicators that could guide our choice. Those thoughts were inspired mainly by my experience with visiting the House of European History twice. In this way, it will correspond with Paweł Ukielski's presentation, which we have just heard. We can make use of the past in two main ways. The first is to treat history as warning, protecting us from repeating past mistakes. In fact, the notion of European unity became popular after the Great War and was realized after the next and more devastating one. The founding fathers of the European Union wanted to avoid future wars and destruction. However, the second use of history is just as important. The past can be a source of pride arising from achievements of our forefathers and give us inspiration to work for the common good. Nowadays, many people think this way of using the past is somehow dangerous and can lead to nationalist xenophobia or some kind of European supremacy. In my opinion, this is one of the reasons why the exposition in the House of European History is focused mainly on the dark side of the past. While there is some truth to that, omitting the glorious aspect of history can be very dangerous. Such a dark vision of the past will cause resistance and ultimately rejection. It is impossible to build any elements of European identity basing only on struggling to overcome the past instead of drawing from it. Even in the darkest chapters of European history, we can find some bright pages, like resistance movements against totalitarian systems. In other words, what we need is a healthy balance between remembering our faults and achievements, between warnings and encouragements. Another balance which we need to keep is the one of regional, national and European memories. The last one shouldn't try to replace the others, because people would consider it as a threat to their existing identity. On the other hand, without the elements of common remembrance, real European unity will never be built. Fortunately, there is no need to create any artificial memories. We can base it on the solid ground of actual common history of our continent. European identity should be built on the basis of rule of subsidiarity. So we should have a few elements of our identity, and to be an European is just one of them, not the only one. The next important factor is inclusiveness. I must admit that my first impression, and very strong impression, after visiting the House of European History was feeling of being excluded from this vision of the past. It is not my history. I don't feel this history presented there is my history or history of my nation, etc. Obviously, it is not possible to build a narrative line of history of Europe that would satisfy everyone. But I believe it is possible to propose one that will create a feeling of belonging for most people. However, the way to achieve it is not simply to make some kind of a compilation of national histories. In my opinion, this goal can be reached by referencing both to the common roots and shared experiences. The most important among the former are Judeo-Christian religion and ethics, with the concept of human dignity, ancient culture, including Greek philosophy and Roman law. Among the latter, we have not only wars and other conflicts, but also important historical processes like modernization, democratization, cultural and intellectual movement like Renaissance or Enlightenment. Some of the past experiences, like communist dictatorship, are not shared by the whole continent, but they are so important that they should be included in the European remembrance. In this moment, someone could raise the question, how should we choose the elements of the history to build European remembrance? Because our common history is so rich, and it is not possible to remember about everything. I am not going to propose now any list of events, historical processes and phenomena. I just would like to remind some basic rules of creating any kind of common memory. The first one is that remembrance reflects not only past, but also present day. We choose which part of the past we want to remember, what is important for us. A good example are values. We want to be rooted in the history. So, if we create a list of European values, it would be easy to connect them with the past events. The problem is that the phrase European values is commonly used, but I am pretty sure that people understand different things when saying it. The second rule, or simpler fact, is that creation of remembrance is a long-term natural process, and we shouldn't try to speed it up. Any attempt to achieve quick effects can jeopardize the whole idea. This process has many actors: international organizations, national institutions, NGOs, museums, schools, etc. Sometimes even individuals can play a role. Perspective of centralization may be appealing, but dangerous. Another rather obvious observation is that the biggest part of our common memory is reflecting the contemporary history. Therefore, when attempting to create European memory, we should focus on 20th century, the century of totalitarian regimes and the resistance against them. We have to take into consideration the existing conflicts of memory on various levels, both bilateral, national, and multilateral. We are probably not able to solve all of them, but if we leave them alone, they will undermine European remembrance, thus European identity. All those thoughts may seem simple and obvious, but maybe this is the right time to start the debate on European remembrance from the very beginning. And maybe this idea applies not only to remembrance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I will ask to take the floor Professor Hannes Gissurarson from Iceland, who will deliver a speech, Making the Voices of the Victims Heard, Some Proposals. Hannes, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, what I would like to do here is to discuss with you how we can make the voices of the victims heard. What Elie Wiesel, he said, the executioner always kills twice, and the second time with silence. And our task is to try to break the silence of the victims. What has been discussed there many times is that communism in history has not been indicted as clearly as Nazism. Nobody would dream of wearing a T-shirt with Goebbels or Himmler or Hitler, especially not at universities. But people are wearing T-shirts with Stalin and Che Guevara. Then there are, as has also been mentioned here today, some vested interests, both in universities and in former political parties, former communist parties, in trying to evade and obscure the historical role of communism and the very fact that communism is criminal in nature. After the war, for example, in a neighboring country of mine, Norway, it was made, even if I'm not entirely sure that there are strong arguments for it, but it was made a crime to have been a member of the Nazi party during the war, and it was a retroactive legislation. So communism is, in my opinion, criminal in nature, and this has not been recognized in traditional narratives of the 20th century. And it is in this context crucial to uphold and to develop the concept of totalitarianism, namely the fact that communism and National Socialism are two of a kind. And what I would like to do is to make 6 proposals to break the silence, to make the voices of the victims heard. One of them is to move towards reducing the imbalance in discourse because the universities have been taken over by left-wing apologists that try to minimize basically the role of communism in history. So what is necessary is to establish, as has been done by many members of this platform, independent institutes. Besides those that are here, I mentioned, for example, the Hoover Institution, where I've been doing research and other such. Then it's essential also to have fair and balanced textbooks and to use our critical faculties to try to correct some of the erroneous or partial narratives about the past that we see in textbooks. Set up memorials and museums, cancel honors, remove statues and change street names of communist mass murderers. We do not have a Hitler Plaza. We didn't have a Stalin Plaza. I don't think we have anywhere. But we have Kaliningrad still, to take an example. Hold conferences and seminars, as we are doing now, about the memory of the victims and also on new evidence. I'm going to give you 1 or 2 examples. And 6th proposal is to make anti-totalitarian literature, which is out of print, available online, and in print, and also to develop videos about it and so on. So these are my 6 proposals for breaking the silence. And one thing that Pawel Ukielski discussed here and others is the narratives that were presented with. Do people realize that the Second World War wasn't one war, but 2 wars? First, Hitler and Stalin were allies, and France and Germany were fighting against them. Then there was a second war when we had France, United Kingdom, United States and Soviet Union against Italy and Germany. This is not always recognized in the narratives about the Second World War. And what we have to do also is to realize and put into textbooks accounts like the one very moving, very well written by Ants Oras called Baltic Eclipse, about the Baltic countries. And Robert Conquest, this extraordinary historian who wrote about the famine, about the terror, and about the prison camps in the Soviet Union. This is something that really has to be written into textbooks. And then there is this new evidence that we are presented with, like Yung Xiang, who is here, who did Wild Swans, and also a remarkable, striking biography of Mao, with a lot of revelations and new interesting facts. Anne Applebaum, who did books about the Gulag and the Iron Curtain. And Frank Dikötter, who has written an extremely interesting and informative trilogy on the Chinese Revolution, demonstrating that in the famine that Mao instigated in 1958 to 1962, 44 million people died. At the same time as man was able to send satellites around the Earth, and then only 10 years later to go to the moon. 45 billion perished as a result of the lack of food in China. And he also wrote a book about the communist takeover that in 1949 that resulted in a bloodbath in China. And this is new evidence that has to be presented and has to be remembered by the world. Now, what we did in Iceland at my little institute is that we instigated a series of reprints of anti-totalitarian literature. The communists were quite strong in Iceland, and that of course meant that the opposition was also rejuvenated to the communists, so there was a lot of anti-totalitarian books that were published in the Cold War and before then. And what we have done in recent years is to reprint the books. I've edited them and made some endnotes, and we put them online. And the main idea is that if people are doing scholarly research, or if students are writing papers, set papers in school, then this is accessible to them. They Google, they go online, they see what's written about things, and then this pops up. It's essential that this evidence is there. And many of those books are great literature, extremely readable, like I Choose Freedom by Viktor Kravchenko, Out of the Night by Jan Waltin, and of course the dystopian, anti-utopian novels by George Orwell, and Darkness at Noon by Koestler, and so on. These are the books that we are reprinting. Very interesting, well-written books. And we have also republished books about people who were in the prison camps, like Atami Kuorti, Eleanor Lipper, and Margaret Buber Neumann. Margaret Buber Neumann is actually very interesting for one reason. First, she was a prisoner of Stalin. And then, when Stalin made the non-aggression pact with Hitler, he handed over the German communists. He collected them all from the prison camps in the Soviet Union and delivered them to Gestapo. And Margaret Buber Neumann was one of them. So she spent her war years, after having been in a Soviet prison camp, in Ravensbrück, in a German camp. And one of the most eloquent writers that I'm republishing is Arthur Koestler, of course. And Arthur Koestler said, the problem with statistics is that they don't bleed. We hear that 100 million people have perished as a result of communism, but we do not become emotionally attached to it. It's just a statistic for many of us. So, in the end, I would just say this. What we have to do, and that's in direct continuation of what I said about Arthur Koestler, is history sometimes is written as if in terms of numbers, so that persons are turned into numbers. But what Andrea Zverer, I think, quoted this morning was, what we have to do is to turn numbers into people.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hannes, for your proposals. And now I will ask Mr. Zsolt Szilagyi to deliver a speech. East and West, double memory or double standards.
Thank you. I will continue the idea what was raised by Pavel and Hannes. But before my speech, as a participant, let me say thank you for Andrea Valic and her institute. You've done an excellent job for bringing us here, and I would like to say thank you for the leadership of the Slovenian Parliament. It's an excellent opportunity to be here inside the Parliament, showing that our problems are possible and necessary to be resolved by decision makers, as we heard also the Albanian presentation. Without a political background, without a political commitment, our questions, our problems are not resolved. Second, let me say, let us congratulate to our Polish friends and colleagues. They celebrated before yesterday the 100 years anniversary. So we are happy that we have distinguished ambassadors here, and unfortunately the Hungarian ambassador left, but she was here. So we are happy that we are helped and we are followed also by government. So no united Europe without a fragmented historical memory. We have a united Europe. We do not have a united memory, historical memory. Not only in Central East European countries or nations, but also in the case of Western European nations. The historical memory is part of our collective cultural memory. So we could say that the European identity is divided by two different narratives, unfortunately. There is a slogan of the Council of Europe saying all different, all equal, which is right. And this contains also the respect to the other side. I was shocked in the European Parliament when I've seen the Red Star. Young people coming to attend European events in the European Parliament in Brussels, they wear proudly the Red Star. Hannes told us even worse cases like Stalin or Che Guevara on the T-shirt. But I asked them, they were from Spain, I think. I asked them, hey guys, if I'm coming tomorrow with the swastika, you will be happy? Because I think that both swastika and the Red Star belongs to the dark history, which should be handled in the same way. And they said, no, it's not the same. They said, why? I mean, both are killing regimes. In their nature, they are killing people. So how could you make a difference between them? And they said, well, yes, the extreme right and the extreme left are the same, but the extreme left is tolerant. So I was shocked, because I realized that they have no knowledge. They were youngsters. They were educated by their school system, and there was a huge lack of knowledge. And when I presented, after 10 minutes, I presented what horrible things communism made in the humankind history and in my country, in my region, they said, well, we should learn more. So we could say that the European Union has now an integrated, jointly accepted narrative about the European history. But what is worse, that not even the European institutions do not have a joint appreciation on European history. Unfortunately, the Commission is led by a politician, Mr. Juncker, who is saying that Marx is a hero. He went this year delivering a speech in Trier at the anniversary of Marx. He was accepting to participate to reveal the statue of Marx donated by the Chinese government, and he delivered a speech saying that Marx is not guilty. And he's representing us. The Parliament, on the other side, in 2009, said both Nazism and communism should be handled with the same measure. This is very important. The Parliament, the only democratically elected body in the European Union, Parliament, Council, and the Commission, and the Parliament has this resolution, which should be a cornerstone. So why Europe do not have a joint narrative on European history? The lack of knowledge. I think the French Revolution is taught in our countries, in our curricula, but the Polish or the Romanian Revolution, I think not even a word. Stéphane Courtois told us last year in Paris that the whole elite dealing with history in France is very leftish, is amazed about Lenin. You remember when we were in Paris, Stéphane Courtois told us that he was practically under media embargo because he's not following the mainstream, because he's saying what's his truth, what is his belief, and he was almost under media embargo due his views. Now, second, the ignorance. So, lack of knowledge, ignorance. They have many problems in the West. We have our problems, of course. After the enlargement of the European Union, our problems became their problems too. And they said, okay, come with solutions, not with the problems. So they do not care to resolve our problems if we do not offer solutions. Third, political interest. So there are communist parties helping actual governments in Western countries. There are other parties rooted in the past which are backed, helped by the left in the West. So it is a political interest, not to weaken them, but to help them to increase. Fourth, media. There are many criticisms on media. I would not say that media is homogeneous. Of course, media is pluralistic. But I was shocked about the words of Stéphane Courtois, a historian with a high prestige, saying that I was under media embargo in France. So the media is many times criticized that it's not presenting in the same way Nazism and communism, because in many cases dominant media channels or media organs are leftish. And we should say that the actual political culture in the Western Europe has a different value order than we desired. I'm coming from Romania. My cultural background is Hungarian, but of course, we hoped when we were invited to join the Union that our problems will be resolved. But it is not true. I mean, many times they do not understand us. Okay. So the Commission shows exactly that this leftish approach, how could be practiced as a European policy. 4 years ago, we invited in Hague the European Commission official dealing with our issue, the European Remembrance. And I think she was a Dutch lady or a British country member representing the Commission. And she said, well, we offer funds for research for Nazism and Stalinism. And we tried to explain her that they could offer money for research for Nazism and communism or for Stalinism and Hitlerism. But it's not the same couple. Nazism and Stalinism. After the death of Stalin, the communism did not become a human face system. That remained a killing system. But they do not understand this, or they do not want to understand this. Okay, so the target is to reveal the nature of repression of the dictatorship and to present it both to the West and to the East as all totalitarian regimes try to gain control on everywhere and to destroy all possible groups of resistance. In case of Romania, for example, they destroyed the traditional churches. The Greek Catholic Church was banned after 1948 in Romania. Their leaders were killed, tortured, jailed. The traditional communities, families, nobles, etc., and minorities, ethnic, religious, linguistic minorities. After 1945, Germans living in the Banat, the Schwaben, were declared all fascist, and they were deported to the Buragan, just because having a German name. Even they were not enrolled in the German army, they were not volunteers, or they were not enrolled by force. You have a German name, you are a fascist. Hungarians after 1956 in Transylvania also, and not only Hungarians, also Romanians, about 30,000 persecutions happened in Romania after 1956, also, although in Transylvania, in Romania, we had no revolution in 56. There were triings in Timișoara, 2,000 students were escorted rapidly, but after the repression started in Hungary, in 57 and later on, 44 death penalties were executed in Romania just because of the Hungarian Revolution. 44 death penalties. And hundreds of sentences for years. 30,000 persons were persecuted in Romania after 56. Okay. Now, to end my story, of course. So the decision is always political. Of course, we try to present our approach scientifically, because these mass graves, what we listened from the chief of the archives in Slovenia, should not be kept in secret. In Romania, we have Marius Oprea, for example, who is doing the same. And he is saying that in Romania, the possible number of hidden graves are 10,000 in Romania, which are not discovered. Here, it is clear that it is not only Slovenian history, or not only Yugoslavian history, it's a European issue. And we see from Brussels an ignorance. Or they do not want to tackle this problem. Why this double standard? So why we should face this double standard when we try to explain that for us we suffered both fascism, Nazism and communism, but the West many times do not understand or not want to understand us. Okay? So finally, I would say that education is vital. We should start on the line of our reader, which was redacted, to ask European Commission officials to extend, to teach the history of communism in the Western European countries. We should start to break silence, as we did at the case of the House of European History. And we should be polite, of course, but very committed. So I was shocked in the House of European History when I've seen that they present the solidarity, the Polish Revolution, the Central East Europe, without mentioning John Paul II. You can imagine that the platform asked officially the texts of the inscriptions from the House of European History, and they did not deliver this. It's a public institution made by public money, European taxpayers' money, and we still, I think, Peter, you can confirm, we still did not received since last August, the texts redacted and shown in the House of European History, which shows that they are aware that something should be hidden. So we should stand united, at least those countries, in this case Central East European countries with our Western European friends, to be united, because it's not a question of a nation or of a country, it's the question of joint European history, joint European memory, and the question of joint European identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Zsolt. I will add only that in House of European History we also have Nazism and Stalinism, not Nazism and communism. So, this is exactly the case. And our last speaker from Estonia, Toomas Hiio, who will deliver a speech, United Remembrance of Europe, created historical identities of the nations, history and historical truth.
Thank you, Pavel. Sorry. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, last week most European countries, United States, Russia and Turkey, to say nothing of Australia and New Zealand, commemorated the end of hostilities on the Western Front of the Great War. The armistice was signed 100 years ago in the forest on Compiègne. Armistices with Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Austria and Hungary were signed some weeks earlier. Since December of 2017, many countries from Iceland to North Yemen, but mainly in the eastern part of the European Union, have been celebrating their centennials. 4 empires, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia and the Ottoman Empire, collapsed 100 years ago, and their former national minorities created a number of new states. The independence declarations of former parts of the Russian Empire, from Finland in the north to Azerbaijan at the Persian border, became possible due to the victory of Central Powers on the Eastern Front in spring of 1918. The peace treaties of Brest-Litovsk and Bucharest, signed in the spring of 1918, brought the battles on the Eastern Front to an end. This was later largely forgotten because these treaties were renounced according to the terms of armistice of Compiègne. Poles, Czechs and Slovaks, Croatians and Slovenes, but also Latvians achieved their independence after the defeat of Germany and Austria-Hungary on the Western Front and Italy in the autumn of 1918. Romania, Serbia and Montenegro had been allies of the Entente. Bulgaria was one of the Central Powers. The new order of Europe was chalked out by the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, in his 14 points in January of 1918. He promised the re-establishment of the Polish state and autonomous development for the nations of Austria-Hungary. The government of Soviet Russia had already published its declaration of the rights of the peoples of Russia 2 months earlier. Both documents were tactical moves for weakening the enemy by undermining the rear of the Central Powers as well as Russian whites. A quarter of a century later, the Atlantic Charter was signed by Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in August of 1941. The members of the national resistance in the countries occupied by one or another totalitarian empire took it as a promise of a righteous world order after the ineluctable victory of the Allied powers. These declarations have later acquired much greater importance than their authors attached to them. The Great War was not caused by nationalism. It was caused by conflicts between the 4 continental and 2 colonial empires. It was an imperialist war between empires and their allies. There were no real winners in this war. Millions of men were killed on the battlefields, and millions of men and women died from diseases at the end of the war. Radical political movements gained ground all over Europe during the last years of the war. World revolution did not begin, but Bolshevist, fascist and national socialist ideologies, totalitarian ideologies, won millions of supporters from among people who had lost everything they had believed in. The statehood of most contemporary East European countries was established or restored in 1918. Most of them had had a long history with their own kings, dukes or princes, and their own elites in the Middle Ages and later. They have had the pride and memory of a glorious history passed down from generation to generation through centuries of foreign rule, and rediscovered by the newborn national elites in the era of Romanticism. These stories have survived to this day and are influential. For example, every Estonian knows that our direct ancestors came to the shores of Baltic Sea 5,000 years ago, long before the Germanic and Slavic peoples came to Europe, and that Estonian rulers had a sort of statehood before the Teutonic Crusaders invaded at the start of the 13th century. You can see, dear colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, a claim to the rights of primogeniture here, but simultaneously a self-identification as survivors in spite of foreign hegemony over long centuries. Every European nation has similar stories, not always verified by serious scholars, but nice anyway. In the parliaments of the new countries, socialist, labor and conservative parties fought each other, along with peasants and various nationalists. Liberals were weak, but they were weak in Western Europe too. It's no wonder that after the Great Depression, in some countries earlier already, the people pinned their hopes on and put their trust in strong leaders who had often been the founding fathers of the new or newly established states 10-15 years earlier. During the Second World War, the majority of European countries were occupied for some period of time by one or another totalitarian empire. Except for the neutral states, only Finland and the United Kingdom were not occupied by an Axis power or the Soviet Union. The Baltic states were the only former members of the new League of Nations whose independence was not re-established after the end of the war. They remained under Soviet occupation. Most of the rest of the Eastern Europe was forced into the Eastern Bloc under the rigid Soviet control and with the presence of Soviet troops until the collapse of the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, it initially seemed quite simple for us. The enemies we had to fight were the communist legacy in society and in our minds, and social and economic backwardness. The goals to be achieved were membership in the European Union and NATO. Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history. Liberal democracy seemed the only choice. EU enlargement was the slogan of countless conferences and meetings from Paris to Helsinki and London to Sofia. On the other hand, this did not hinder the restoration of the pre-war states and the rehabilitation of the former rulers. Their authoritarianism was not a big problem. They had been the founding fathers of the nation, and it was true indeed. Politicians like parallels with their predecessors in the past. Legal continuity with the pre-war state is a cornerstone of self-identification for many countries that had fallen under communist rule after the Second World War. My countrymen stress that Estonia is not a former Soviet republic. Instead, Estonia is a nation-state founded in 1918 and occupied by the Soviets in 1940. The problems of former member states of the Warsaw Pact are slightly different. They did not need to constantly corroborate that their country is a state like others. On the other hand, The self-identification as a communist society and a socialist state never emerged among the Soviet-occupied Baltic nations. But the absence of political parties founded on a communist or even Euro-communist legacy did not hinder the emergence of populism of a different color and shape. The politics of memory are based largely on survivors and their societies. We have seen it in the case of the Holocaust and recently are seeing it in the case of the victims of communist regimes. Societies are ready and able to forget. This is not entirely bad. We cannot force our children and grandchildren to live with all our memoirs and traumas. But on the other hand, the years under totalitarian regimes of the 20th century have become part of our national identities. Together with armed resistance, together with national resistance, and last but not least, together with collaboration and participation in crimes against humanity. These crimes were initiated by totalitarian ideologies of empires that were born from the ashes of the Great War. But our own countrymen were there carrying out these policies at different levels of leadership or in service. We cannot forget our victims and our perpetrators. This is part of our national experience and of European historical experience. It is our responsibility to prevent created identities and imagined stories from taking over the field of research-based treatment of the past. This might be the dark side of collective memory and identity studies, when invented stories try to take the place of history. Communism was dead, but nobody had seen its corpse was a joke at the end of the 90s. Russia has recovered and started searching for opportunities to re-establish its position among the great powers. China has become a superpower, but has preserved the communist one-party state system. In last year's list of world countries by population, Germany, the biggest European country, occupies only the 16th position. In the list of countries by general domestic product, Germany, the United Kingdom, France and Italy are among the first 10 countries. Yet the European Union as a whole is in second place. But many things have changed over the last 30 years, such as the terrorist attack against the United States in 2001 and the following war against terror, the wars in Georgia and Ukraine, as well as the Arab Spring of 2012 with high hopes, we remember. Yet civil wars and the migration pressure on Europe that followed have defined the new environment of international relations, but also the domestic politics of the member states of the European Union. United remembrance cannot be united disremembrance. Politicians and diplomats sometimes say, leave history to historians. But the histories of individual countries, wars and international relations have had and continue to have enormous importance in international and domestic politics. Sometimes unfortunate or deliberate historical parallels are drawn in the interest of achieving short-term goals. We have seen it last week too. The term nationalism has too many various meanings to allow the play on words here. Nationalism did not cause the Great War. It was caused by the policies of the empires. But most modern European countries were born from 19th century nationalism. In the list of goals of the platform of European memory and conscience, the first one is, I am quoting, to increase public awareness about European history and crimes committed by totalitarian regimes and to encourage a broad European-wide discussion about the causes and consequences of totalitarian rule, as well as about common European values with the aim of promoting human dignity and human rights. Let's follow it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Toomas. That was the last speech of our conference today.